Hey everyone, this is Andrea. This is a research conversation with Lynn Nadel. There's so many people coming from different fields who listen to this, but as you know, I'm trying to understand cognition as navigability, as ways we move through the world, ways we make in the world, ways we find in the world. I'm looking at this framework across many different disciplines and trying to just get a good idea, a better idea of how to think about cognition is something we share as many different forms of life, and I can see that navigability is one way that we could begin to understand that cognition is an ecological act that happens at all scales and species. So towards that, what really got me into that was my study in neuroscience of the hippocampus and this area of the brain. There's many areas sort of associated with navigation that are also associated with memory, a specific kind of memory, but just in a general way, let me just say that, this area of the brain was really famous in the 50s for memory from a guy named H.M., which I'll just link to some writings about this if you're interested, but he had this area of his brain removed and he couldn't create new memories. That's a very generalized conception for those of you who haven't heard of him. And then later in the 70s, a man named John O'Keefe had this kind of discovery of cells in the same area of the brain that work almost like a GPS. Again, this is all very generalized, but there are cells in our brains which fire in very specific patterns relative to how we move through the world. And they are referred to often as the sat-nav of the brain or the GPS of the brain. They're called place cells and grid cells and border cells, head direction cells, and many people like Rank and the Mosers, of course O'Keefe, were involved in this process of discovering these cells, or in the case of Lynn, writing about them, thinking about them theoretically in concern to the hippocampus. And he and John O'Keefe wrote a book together, which has been a really formative book. The book is called The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, and Cognitive Map comes from work from another man named Edward Tolman, who's also very interesting. There's so many interesting people and characters. I'm actually writing a book about this time period, which is why this is one research conversation, but it's also research for philosophical ideas relative to this channel. I was at a conference actually a couple years ago in Arizona, which is where Lynn has been for many years. He was the department head there, and he's been teaching there many years. And there was a space-time conference with kind of all the greats, and it was the first time I was ever in the same place as Lynn Nadel and John O'Keefe, who for me, writing this book and studying cognition as navigability and just being excited about these ideas, was quite a moment to see them both together there. And of course, I tried to take some pictures of them, and I have no idea why, but as you can see here, the pictures all turned out blurry. But this is Lynn Nadel and John O'Keefe in Arizona at the Space-Time Conference in, maybe 2022. Maybe you've heard of a place called McGill University in Montreal. Pretty much everyone I've mentioned so far was there around the same time period in the 50s, 60s, 70s when neuroscience was forming. And H.M., Penfield, and Hebb, Donald Hebb, this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together, you may have heard. I think of this time period and this university as like the superhero headquarters of what became neuroscience. Lynn and I talk about it. He was there. He was also at McGill. So was John O'Keefe. So was Brenda Milner, the person who's famous for the studies of H.M. relative to the hippocampus. It's a really exciting time period relative to how we study this area of the brain and what it might mean, and opening up wider scales of how to understand these big themes like cognition and navigation and their relation to one another. Of course, there's many different ways of looking at it. But Tolman conducted these experiments where he started to develop this idea of latent learning, is maybe how you've heard of it. Kind of just how we move through the world is a kind of knowledge gathering, or just that we move through the world and we don't realize that we're learning certain routes and paths, but later we can find our way without thinking about it because we've just learned it. And this is where this connection is between cognition and navigability. And we can see it in many different landscapes, not only these geographical landscapes, but also how we move through landscapes of language, emotional landscapes, and so on. But in this conversation with Lynn, we really talk about this very early time period where the idea of cognitive maps was just starting. no one had even discovered place cells yet. John discovered that in the 70s. So this is about those early years. And all the names that he mentions here are famous names in this little world of neuroscience. But these names and this little world of neuroscience actually has really big implications across how we're coming to understand what it means to develop knowledge and memory, and how this connects us to other beings in the world. So we're going to talk about the superhero world of scientists at McGill in Montreal, and we're going to talk a little bit about the development of this idea of cognitive maps. So thanks for being here. I hope you're all doing really well. Let's go. So thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. I know you have to travel soon, huh? To Amsterdam, right?
Tomorrow.
Yeah. Coming to my part of the world. Although I'm in Poland right now. Thus the background, in case you see some religious pictures.
On business or pleasure, or both?
Both.
Where in Poland?
We're in Krakow. You probably know it. I know you know Poland.
We're in Poland, but in Krakow. Yeah, I know Krakow. Nice city. Great town square.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, let's not take up too much time with that.
Yeah, let's get started. I guess it's probably best to jump in and start with the McGill years. And as I told you, the narrative is I'm really looking for ways to connect all of you. Actually, it's not that hard to do because of this extraordinary time period at McGill, and that you and John were actually there, and so on. But what I'm still struggling with a little bit in the text is the Tolman, because his story is so interesting. It's so crucial to your work. And I'm trying to connect the dots a little more between maybe even just this kind of academic family tree, how it sort of got from Tolman to you, Hebb, and so on. So I'm just throwing that out in case anything comes to mind. So we can go ahead and start after you'd gotten into McGill, you were studying chemistry, and then I guess you could tell me a little bit about how you first sort of discovered psychology department and this superhero world of scientists.
To say that I was studying chemistry is to put much more on it than existed. I was not a very good student in my first few years, and I was there because I had an interest in chemistry, which was not deep. It was based on the fact that my father had been a chemist, and McGill was a good place to study chemistry, but I wasn't really studying chemistry. I wasn't really studying anything.
Few of us are our first year of college.
Yeah, exactly. I was just but one thing did become quite clear from the chemistry labs that I did, which was that I probably shouldn't become a chemist.
Why was that? Not so good in the lab?
Not so good. I was not sufficiently careful, shall we say.
Did you drop some beakers?
I might have damaged my I persisted. So it became clear that that was not a course. So I was just looking around for something else to do as an undergrad. You needed to have a major or something. So I switched over to biology. And then I started taking, a variety of courses in biology, including psychology, because why not? I was always interested in that kind of stuff, but not particularly focused on it. And of course, this was the intro to psych course was taught by Hebb. So I didn't go to McGill because of Hebb. I didn't sign up for that class. I didn't even know who Hebb was.
Oh, you didn't even know when you signed up?
Wow. I didn't know how famous he was. I had none of this knowledge to me. I simply signed up for a class in intro to psych.
Was he already really famous then?
Oh yeah, he was already.
Okay, because he was writing his book still, or it was already out.
I mean, this was 1960. This was 1961.
Okay.
He was probably president of APA. His book came out in 49. I mean,
right. The Fire Together, Why Together thing was already.
That was already out. I mean, all of that was out there. Although it was not that popular in North America yet.
Right. Right.
That's a part of the story here.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he was very famous in Canada. He was famous around the world, but that didn't mean people agreed with his approach. But he was very famous. I didn't know it. I took his class. It was fascinating, and I started to basically just took a lot of psychology classes without majoring in psych, and I was on a bit of a pre-med track, so to speak, thinking.
Okay. Do you remember what caught you in his class?
Just how interesting.
Just the way it was.
just, and I was, it is the case that I had been interested even when I was a kid about, brains and when they go wrong and what happens when somebody's crazy, but it was like, I was interested in that. And I was also interested in baseball and hockey. It wasn't like a passion of mine, but it was something I was in. And so it matched up with some early interests I had, vague, inchoate sort of stuff. And it just tickled it. So I started taking a lot of psych classes, and I was pre-med. And then I didn't get into medical school because of my first 2 years, and my grades were pretty poor. And so I had a year, and by this point I was married with one kid and another kid.
Oh, wow. Got married young.
Yeah, I got married young, foolishly, but did. And so I ended up getting a job working for a year in a psych lab because I thought, let's see what that's like. Right. And I was
on campus, or?
Oh yeah, in the psych department. I somehow engaged myself with people in the psych department, got a job as a gap year, so to speak, an unforced gap year, working in doing behavioral psychopharmacology work with Dalbir Bindra, a professor in psychology. And that really sold me. I mean, even though it's really pretty boring research, that really sold me on. And because I was there for the whole year in the department, in the animal lab area, I mixed with all the graduate students and so on. I was treated like a graduate student almost. And then remarkably, they let me into the graduate program, which they didn't used to do, which they didn't had a policy of not taking.
Right. You're not supposed to get to do both at the same school or something.
Exactly right. That policy was more strictly enforced in those years than it is now, by the way. Anyway, they let me in, and that was the beginning of it, and O'Keefe was a first year graduate student the year that I was working in the lab before I started as a graduate student. So John showed up at the same time that I more or less connected with psychology at that research level. So
do you remember the first time you met him? Or an early time? Any first impressions? Or
he was a little older, nice guy, smart, a little different, settled, married to a nice woman he's still married to, Eileen. Nice, quirky, smart, and a little older and sort of wiser, and not as wild and crazy as some of the rest of us were. A little more, a more settled person. Always was and always has been.
Yeah. He'd already had some other life before that too.
Yeah, I think so. And he was, the thing was that at that point, that year, the animal psychology thing was split between a couple of different places. We weren't all in one place. And John was working with Ron Melzak in a different house, completely separate from the rest of us who were working, with Milner or with some of the other students with Melzak, me with Bindra, and if Hebb had any students working with animals. We were all together in one place near the medical school. And then there was Melzak, who had recently been hired. And John was one of his first graduate students, and they were doing cat research in an old building separate from everyone else.
Oh, okay. It's kind of off to the side then.
Off to the side. Actually, didn't see a lot of John that first year, other than when he would just happen to be around for seminars or for somebody coming to give a talk and stuff like that. Because he was a year ahead of me, so I was not in seminars with him specifically. So John and I were friendly during grad school, quite friendly, because we shared political interests. We were both semi-socialist kind of politics. But other than that, we didn't have a lot to do with each other research-wise because we were not in the same space.
I'd like to hear a little bit about that, this social thing, because it's a bit different than now. I mean, during that time, what did it feel like?
That was a time during which, if you were a graduate student, even if you were married and had kids like I was, the lab was the center of your life. It was not a 9-to-5 job. There was no balance, life, quality of life balance nonsense, nothing like that. You were in the lab all the time, basically, and as I was, and as my wife would hang out in the lab, and the kid and the little baby thing would be sitting off to the side while I was doing surgeries. It was all mixed together, basically. There was no separation of any of that, and it really dominated, one's life and one's life. So I did not have a social life outside the sort of group of people that I was a graduate student with, by and large. Some did, some didn't, but by and large, we all hung out together all the time. We spent all of our time together.
Did you
So
have
John,
seminars with Brenda Milner?
Brenda Milner was on the periphery of what we were doing, because Brenda Milner was at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which was, you know,
Away.
a ways. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
there very often unless there was a talk to be heard or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
She would show up at seminars. She, at that time, of course, was married to Peter Milner.
Mm-hmm. So he was closer to you, probably.
Way closer. He was the
Yeah.
one that we were all the closest with, because
Okay.
Peter was, at that point, Peter was writing his 1970 physiological psychology textbook,
Oh yeah.
which is an absolute classic,
Mm-hmm.
by far the best textbook ever written.
It's really stood the test of time, that one, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's an impressive book, basically. And so he was writing that book while we were graduate students, and we were reading mimeographed. There's a word you probably haven't heard, or maybe don't even know what that word means.
I don't. I've heard
So
it, but
mimeograph was a machine for making copies before faxes. The pre-fax thing, all I can tell you is it used ink and your hands got messy.
okay.
But it
That gives me a good image.
and the ink it used tended to be purple. Have you ever seen old reprints that
Oh
had
wow. That
like
sounds familiar. I mean, I've been in a lot of libraries and
yeah,
archives, and I've definitely
that's
seen purple ink.
that's what identifies it. Anyway,
Okay.
he was passing around mimeograph copies of his chapters of his book that we
Oh
were
wow.
reading in seminar. So Peter was in full bloom, and he was the one we all went to for questions, and he was the guy who knew everything. I mean, it's remarkable because he's writing a textbook about the whole field. He was the one we all went to. Melzack was new and a little bit less accessible, but very smart and nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
We interacted with him a fair amount, because even though he had a lab over in this other building, he had an office in the place where the rest of the animal researchers were. He had an office there that he was in and out of, not all that frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Bindra, my advisor Bindra, was a human researcher mostly, and he had just started getting involved with animal research so that he could look at some pharmacology things, and he didn't know much about animal research. So I interacted almost entirely with Milner and Melzack, and he did not have his office where the animal researchers were.
Okay.
Hebb were in another building where the human researchers were. That was the main hub of the psychology department, an old house
Mm-hmm.
on an old street. Do you know Montreal at all?
I've been there like twice.
At the base of the mountain, there are some old streets. Anyway, he had a lovely old house.
Mm-hmm.
The psychology there would meet every afternoon for tea. So
Oh,
very
nice.
British kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
which I got used to. And so it would be tea in the afternoon at 3 or 4 o'clock in the psychology building where Hebb was. And if you wanted to spend time with Hebb, you just would stroll over there. It was about a 10 to 15-minute walk from where the animal lab was, and you do tea in the afternoon. And I did that, fair. So that was how. And so one interacted with Hebb that way, but one also interacted with Hebb by virtue of taking his first year seminar, which was famous, for its idiosyncrasies.
What were
And
those teas like? I have to stop on that one a little bit. Did people ask him questions and he would talk about things, or was it?
it was, they in some ways they were less memorable for me than the teas I subsequently had at UCL with John, with people in the anatomy and physiology department, where the tea every afternoon there, you sat around the table with 3 Nobel Prize winners.
Oof.
That was that was a more daunting tea sort of episode than having tea with Hebb, which itself was, but Hebb was friendly, and actually the person who was most present during the teas, I'm now remembering, was the head of the department, George Ferguson, who was a statistician, but who was a real bon vivant and a bit of a poet, and wrote kind of doggerel poetry and gave great Christmas parties. And I modeled my behavior as department head a little bit after what I observed in him, because he was really a bit of a social glue person in a department. Anyway, so we had tea in the afternoon. We would see Hebb that way. That would be the interaction with Hebb. It would be in and out sort of over the time one was a graduate student, but he was a presence. Then we moved into a new building in about a year and a half before I finished up and John finished up. And then suddenly we were all together in a new building.
Were you already working on the Hippocampus? Because your PhD was on the Hippocampus. How did that happen?
Already working on the, why did I, okay.
Was that any connection between Peter and Brenda and the whole?
Oh, absolutely. We'll segue straight to that. So the big issue there, if you were in that department, you were probably interested in memory as a graduate student, probably not only, but probably Hebb, that's right. So, and then there was Brenda Milner, and then there was HM,
which was already, those papers were already well known. The Scoville and the Penfield stuff was already,
All right, now, so you know some of the background here.
I was trying to get a sense of when it all started to feel. I mean, from my point of view, it feels like it was already kind of huge, but I know it took some time in different parts of the world.
It took some time, and it was somewhat, progress was delayed, you might say, by the fact that the early attempts to kind of create an animal model of HM all failed. So that set the stage for, right off the bat, after the 57 paper, Brenda Milner and a postdoc, Orbach, joined forces with Rasmussen and to do an experiment where they tried to replicate the surgery that was done on HM in a group of monkeys, and then demonstrate that they have a memory defect like HM had a memory defect.
The hippocampus is different though, but I guess you could still.
Animal models.
Yeah, right. I know.
So they prepared the surgery as close as possible to what Scoville had done in HM, and lo and behold, these monkeys had no memory deficit whatsoever. Virtually no memory deficit.
Wow.
A little bit, but nothing. Yeah. Nothing. So, and then people did hippocampal lesions in rats, early hippocampal lesion work in rats in the early 1960s. Same thing. Nothing at all like what was seen in HM. So that was the conundrum in the early 60s. There was this conundrum in the field, like, what's going on here?
That's fascinating. Was there any spatial deficiency?
Nothing.
Nobody was even looking at that, I guess.
Nobody was even looking at any of that stuff. It was the reigning theories of hippocampal function in animals were not memory. They were things like response inhibition or avoidance behavior or emotional.
Oh, wow, fascinating.
A whole range of things, none of which were memory or space.
So closer to amygdala-like behavior.
Exactly right. Okay. Closer to sort of amygdala-like thinking. Part of the limbic system still. From that perspective. And so that was the setting in which I was firstly an undergrad and then a grad student. In that setting, kind of brewing in that broth. And that was the atmosphere in the department, that there's this, we're interested in memory and Hebb's ideas about synaptic memory. And then these ideas that the hippocampus, based on HM is crucial. But what's the story in animal models? We were animal researchers. You can't do much work in humans. So, what do you do? Right. Now there's a couple of small points. When I was an undergrad, taking that first year intro course in psychology, I think I was my second year as an undergrad, I roomed with two other undergrads, one of whom was somebody, Odling Smee.
When you say roomed with, was it like a dorm room kind of thing?
We shared an apartment. Okay. I shared an apartment with two other people. We each had our own room. Odling Smee was his name. I can't remember his first name now. And he ended up doing work in the UK. Doing some interesting behavioral work. And then an American from Boston called Charles Bud Corkin. So my second year roommate, got involved with a graduate student in psychology and ultimately married Suzanne Corkin. And so while I was rooming with him in my second year, taking this course from HM.
So you had that connection. You already had HM in your.
Also hearing a little bit about this crazy, HM person. None of it registered with me at that point. Okay. Now you dial forward a few years. Now I'm a graduate student. HM is in, and there's this disjunct between human and animal stuff. So I had the hypothesis. The hypothesis, which was based on some reality, which is that in the work with humans, HM, for example, the surgery removed most of his anterior hippocampus because that's the way the surgery came in. In the rat work, that was not confirming what was seen in HM. everybody was looking at the dorsal hippocampus, which is the posterior hippocampus in humans. So I had the idea that, well, maybe the disjunct between animal and human work is that they're looking at different parts of the hippocampus. That the human folks are looking at what is the ventral hippocampus in rats, and the rat people are looking at the dorsal hippocampus. So obviously, they're different things. So that was my dissertation.
It's a good hypothesis. I guess it wasn't quite true, but maybe it would have been if you'd had really better information about where HM's lesions really were, because didn't it change a bit?
It changed a little bit, but I think, this was the first. Len Gerard, who just died 4 months ago, I think, also published something on comparing dorsal and ventral hippocampus in the same time, 67, 68. We were the first ones to even think about that, and I did it for the reasons I described, and then I dropped it, more or less. However, I've come back to that.
Didn't you write about that too more recently?
No, recently just published another paper. In 21, published a paper on the long action of the hippocampus. And
I remember.
I'm thinking about, and I really think there's something very important about what's going on. But
there is probably
that original intuition was onto something, but it was not what I thought it was. Anyway, so that's why I worked on the hippocampus. I ended up working on it because of that. But I did not do my master's thesis on that. I did my master's thesis on memory using cortical spreading depression to study the role of the cortex in memory, in habituation memory.
Is that where you started looking at the stuff that you would eventually propose for your PhD? I'm wondering how to connect those things.
There's no connection.
You just had different interests.
There wasn't necessarily a connection. In those days, you could do your master's on one thing and your PhD on something else. Nowadays, people don't do that much anymore. Anyway, I did my master's. I didn't want to. There was no way for me to follow on with that research, given the technologies I had available to me at that time. The kind of world leader in the technique that I used in my master's thesis, this cortical spreading depression, the world leader was in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. That's why I went.
Oh, okay. Well, there's the connection.
That's the connection. That's why I went to do my postdoc there. But I dropped the technique temporarily to jump on the hippocampus bandwagon. That was everybody else's hobby horse in that psych department at the time. So I was following the crowd, you might say.
So you went back to that anyway. But first, can you just tell me a little bit? Do you have any sort of sensory memories of the lab and of being at McGill? Was it?
Oh, a lot of them. Most of them.
What do you think of when you think of it? Was it cold? Was it
cold? Yes, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
First thing.
Always cold.
It was always cold because although of course I spent a number of summers in Montreal, and they were very nice. But anyway, cold. The lab itself was, two completely different eras. The one where we're in this old animal research building next to the medical school off by ourselves. It was like a grungy pre-regulation era, animal lab. None of the heavy duty stuff that is, you go, have you been to Trondheim ever?
No, actually I never went there.
If you visit the Trondheim lab, if you go to their animal lab, you can't even get into the lab without putting on full surgical.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's all behind barriers. Visitors, everybody, proper shoes, everything is completely, aseptic.
Oh, wow.
That's one extreme.
Very sci-fi.
We were at the other extreme.
Okay. You're smoking it in the lab and stuff.
Everything was going on. It was also 1960s, So
right. Yeah, well, I want to hear a little bit about that too. You said you and John shared interests. What was the vibe like? What other kind of things were you talking about at the time? Because there was a lot going on.
Well, we were very politically engaged, both of us. He a little bit even more than me, but we were both politically engaged. I know that he and me a little bit on the sideline was involved in bringing Chomsky to the campus back in the 60s to give talks. We were engaged. We were not on the front line. We were graduate students, but we were very engaged. We were both engaged politically.
It mattered to you.
It mattered to us a lot. We were both very political. And so a lot of what we talked about was politics.
And you both seem to be rather philosophical. I mean, he was already reading a lot of
More than
philosophy,
me. He
and
had a background in philosophy a little bit, and his wife was a PhD philosopher. Eileen
ah,
Eileen is trained in philosophy,
oh,
so
wonderful.
he had more he had much more background in philosophy than I did. Mine was
Hmm.
second acquired.
Were
He
Were
had
you interested in that? I mean, were you trying to
I got
understand
interested
bigger
in
issues then, or?
I got interested in it, in the space issues of, in philosophy of space and philosophy of science issues.
What about the political things? Did you see that as connected to the work you wanted to do in your life when you were young, or did they seem separate? Or is it like
I
separate
was always
compartments?
interested in politics, even from when I was young. I remember from when I was like even trying to date it, when Stalin died. I mean, I was 10, 11, 12. I was seriously reading political stuff when I was a kid.
Oh, wow.
I was always fascinated, always interested in politics. You don't know the New York political scene, I suppose, but in New York in the 50s and 60s, the Jewish community, of which I was nominally a part, but not really, was very progressive and very socialist in its leanings in the
Hmm.
50s.
Yeah,
Times have changed. And anyway, the point is, back then, to be in the community I grew up in was probably to be kind of
political.
socialist leaning and political, if you have ever thought about those things at all. And I did. So I read newspapers voraciously. And John was just like that. John grew up in the same environment,
Hmm.
except he was
Also in New York.
Catholic, Irish Catholic environment, where it's either the
Hmm.
church or politics, one or the other, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So, and that's New York. New York was three. It was three cities, four,
Mm.
one of which the other three ignored. It was a Jewish city, an Italian city, and an Irish city, and they represented, you might say, almost one third of the population. And then there was the fourth world, which was the Hispanic Black part of the city, which the rest of us ignored
Oof.
back in the 50s. I'm being
Yeah.
brutally honest, right? It didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Very, very different world, but it was a world in which politics mattered a lot. I
It
bonded on that. John and I bonded on the interest in politics.
reminds me of a quote. I think guess it's a true quote that you said. I can't remember it perfectly right now. A Jewish boy and a Catholic boy had to go to Canada to meet or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. It's true. Not very far from each other,
Yeah, but I
and
guess that helped that you understood each other in this way.
yeah, but probably it did. Yeah, it did. So we didn't have a lot to do with each other in graduate school. We were friends, but I would not. We did not interact a lot socially in graduate school. I was hanging out with a different group of graduate students. I wouldn't say we connected the work to the politics. They were separate lives at that point, and they really stayed that way mostly.
Mhm.
We weren't working on politically sensitive issues. No, the work was. I mean, we were all crazy in that. We
Mhm.
hung out in the lab all the time because that was all we were thinking about.
Mhm.
And the blackboard was always full of this diagram, that diagram.
Mhm.
How do we figure that out? How do we test Hebb's? How do we test and disprove Hebb's hypothesis? And I mean, it was, we were all there to kind of figure out how the brain did learning and memory, and we were going to do it.
Yeah.
There's a pretty intense atmosphere of that kind of intellectual, ferment, and but we also were fun. We all played, and John was part of this too. We all went out in the afternoons and played soccer on the reservoir. We all had a good time. We
Yeah.
weren't only doing that, but mostly it was, and we had big ideas. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know how that happened. Quite honestly,
Yeah. But you
think
had
it's
a feeling that you wanted to do something in the world. Like you were trying
exactly.
to change the world in a way.
We were in a place where the people we were interacting with had already done that. That was the kind of soup that
Hmm.
we were basically swimming in. That was
Yeah. It was still happening. I mean, it was
that was still happening. It was
yeah.
a world of people who were achieving at that level. Yeah.
McGill.
I didn't know any other world. I didn't go somewhere else in undergrad, so I wasn't like aware that the atmosphere at McGill at that time, in that particular era, the 50s and 60s, was unmatchable. It was
Yeah.
absolutely, it was unique. Now
It
there
is,
are
it
other
still is really. It's kind of without precedent. Maybe
anyway.
UCL.
There are other places like that, and there were other places like that at the time. But I did not realize as somebody who only went to that place,
Hmm.
how unique and special it was, and
I'm
what
not
an
sure. Are there
opportunity.
really other places like that? Because it's hard to trace back so much. I guess at
At that
least in
point
this.
in time, the few places that were sort of like that, and then maybe this will connect back with Tolman. Berkeley was a little bit like that. So the Tolman, in the Tolman era, Penn was a little bit like that in the days of Solomon and so on. Hull, the group that there were clusters of places where there was real strength, basically. But the cluster at Montreal and at McGill was unique in the way that it combined brain and behavior, right?
It was really starting neuroscience.
Exactly.
What we think
that
of
was
as
really what was unique about Hebb. So the people who were attracted to go to graduate school there were already of a mindset, that they were, that they wanted to jostle with the really big issues, and
it's very exciting to think about.
It was a very exciting place, but again, I was so immersed in it that I didn't understand how unusual it was. It took me in other places to realize and to talk with other people, and to experience other universities and other settings, not many of which I've experienced, to realize how unique that was.
Were you always a lucky person, even when you were a kid?
I can only assume that that's the case. Yes.
Yeah, you've had pretty good luck, but you also
I've been very well.
you go with the luck.
You go with the luck. You make your luck a little bit. You take advantage of the lucky opportunities that and I've been probably good at that. But yeah, I've been extremely lucky in that regard. I mean, just
being in the right place at the right time.
Let me weave another thread for you. So the name you mentioned included Bronk and who's fabulous, by the way.
He deserves a lot of credit too.
There's a lot more credit than he gets. And Bob Mueller and John Kuby. So Bob Mueller. So there's a connection to Bob Mueller. This is the small world in which we all navigate. Bob Mueller and I went to the same high school. And
you're kidding.
We not only went to the same high school in the same exact time frame, but we were in the same official class. So we were in Stuyvesant, which is a test-in high school in New York City for supposedly smart kids who want to do science. And and 30 or so, you're broken up into groups of 30, and you each have your homeroom that you start the day in, right, before you move off to your separate classes. And you sit alphabetically in this class. So Bob Mueller sat in front of me.
HAJKLM.
He sat in front of me, and I stared at the back of his head, which was pretty, hairy. So Bob Mueller and I were friends in high school.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow.
And you dial forward, and he ends up befriending in graduate school, completely separate. He ends up befriending in graduate school Eileen O'Keefe.
Oh, again, wow. How weird. Gosh, makes you think the world is just really is a small world system.
And then separately, all of us converge on the hippocampus.
It's crazy. That's crazy.
Do the work that and how it connects up. The story gets better. In all the years that Bob was working on Hippocampus, he and me and John had a lot of good time together. We really knew each other and really liked each other a lot. Bob's dying was a big tragedy.
Yeah, that must have been.
Yes, that was really sad. Anyway, dial forward to 1990. I'm jumping now, but
that's
it's
okay. I'll take you back later.
The Bob Mueller story. In mid-90s, I'm working on the beginnings of the multiple trace theory with Morris Moscovich, and I go to give a talk actually in Eastern Europe about it, and in the audience is Bob Mueller for one reason. I invited a bunch of people. I put this conference together in Eastern Europe and invited a bunch of people who were connected to Eastern Europe through the McDonald Pew grant mechanism. They were funding Eastern Europe in the 90s to try to jumpstart neuroscience in Eastern Europe. Anyway, so I put together a conference, and Bob was involved with one of those groups. Anyway, so Bob was in the audience. I gave this talk about the beginnings of the multiple trace theory. People thought it was a little bit nuts at the time, but anyway, Bob said, "Oh, that's really interesting. I'm editing a special issue of the current opinion in neurobiology, which is this journal that reviews the field in different. I'm going to do the one in cognitive neuroscience. This was 1996. He was for 97. How would you like to write this up for that journal?"
Whoa.
So, okay, that's great. That's a great opportunity. So me and Morris, wrote what became the 97. So we wrote up and submitted it to this journal. And then we started to hear back channel of furious attempts by various people in the field to sabotage this paper so that it will not
Oh,
get,
oh no,
because,
why?
because the
Why?
paper was a direct attack on
Yeah,
standard
yeah, of
consolidation.
course. Mm-hmm.
So I will not go into names. You can whatever you want, but
We could probably figure it out, but
let's say that behind the scenes there were some attempts to sort of squelch
ugh,
this stuff, which is really ugly when you hear about it. But this happens in science, and certainly happened a fair amount back in the day. And
mm-hmm.
and a lot of us knew who the main culprits were, but they were generally people of power. So you there wasn't much one could do. Anyway, so Bob sort of responded to this pressure by telling the people who were pressuring him to go fuck themselves.
Oh wow, it's a
And
good
that
friend
was
to have. It's good you knew
and
that.
that was Bob Mueller in a nutshell. That
Yeah,
was
I love that. I love that New York
yeah,
personality.
that's the New York person, and
Yeah,
it was partly because he was a friend. Also, he was
yeah,
not.
you knew each other.
I think he would have done it for anybody, but I think it mattered that he was somebody who knew me, knew John, and he was knew us, and he wasn't
Yeah, of
about
course.
the bad guys basically determine what was. So he literally said that. I've heard this from multiple sources. So the thing got published, and it has had a
Yeah,
fairly
it's
big
had
impact.
domino
So that's
effect.
so that's a
Now this
Bob.
trace is like
Yeah,
such a word.
yeah, that's Bob Mueller's contribution
Oh,
amongst
that's great
others.
to hear because I want to put him more into the
Yeah, he's a
mix.
hero.
Mm-hmm.
He should be one of the heroes of your story, whatever the
Yeah,
story.
that's good that you say that. It's good you highlight that. But
Heroes.
we're already going. It's
Yeah, I
already
know.
7:15. Gosh, I have so much I want to talk to you about. But I do want to figure out. I want to go to Prague, but
Yep.
had you already been thinking about Tolman at all when you were still in McGill at McGill?
I mean, so Tolman, you asked how do we get to Tolman? Well, Hebb was a big fan of Tolman, and
Mm-hmm.
Hebb was a big fan of cognitive approaches too. And Hebb was we talked about cell assemblies and phase sequences. Well, what were those other than Tolman's internal models? And so we were
Okay.
very sympathetic. So
So
we
was he
so we
speaking about that in those intro classes, or was
Hebb
that
in his seminar, we were reading all about the debates that were going on in the field, and Tolman at that point was central to them. And Hebb was
okay?
sympathetic, even though Hebb was very uh, positive about Skinner and about Hull and their contributions. He was also very open to Tolman and to the points that Tolman was making, and the emphasis that Tolman was putting on what was going on inside the
Knowledge.
head.
Yeah.
Because Hebb was there also. There was stuff going on in between, and
Mm-hmm.
Tolman was
Mm-hmm.
the only one who was saying that, from
Mm-hmm.
a point of view. So we were open to Tolman, and we were not like heavily focused on Tolman because we weren't looking for that. John was
Mm-hmm.
not looking for space. John
No,
was
no,
looking.
no.
John was looking for memory. He was
Yeah.
not.
I guess I wonder if Hebb ever mentioned anything about seeing Tolman when he came to speak there at McGill or any of, I mean, just to connect back to that political social issue because Tolman had all that going
Tolman was
on.
very political, and that was
Mm-hmm.
another reason why both John and I liked him.
Okay.
We were well aware of Tolman's political sort of
Mm-hmm.
lead, so that gave Tolman a leg up, right off the bat for both of us,
Mm-hmm.
and
Because he really
that
did
remained.
something big for science in kind of
Yeah,
opposing that McCarthy stuff and
absolutely.
fighting
So
for it.
Tolman was a hero for both of us
Mm-hmm.
already, even before the cognitive map stuff. But we didn't know a lot about his political heroism. We knew about it, but we didn't know a lot about it. But it was
Mm-hmm.
enough to put him in our. It was an easy jump to Tolman. Once the play cells were, it wasn't like, oh, what could that be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like,
you
oh,
couldn't have even imagined it at the time, but once you saw that. So, okay, so why Prague? Was it all this political stuff? Or, I mean, you could have done
it was
many
partly
things.
political. For me, it was partly political, but it was, first of all, I applied to 3 places for postdocs. Both John and I applied to NIH for postdoctoral fellowships to
Okay.
go to go overseas.
And you
That
both
came.
got them.
We both got them. That comes a
Uh-huh.
bit later. I applied to 3 places. I applied to Hernandez Peon, who was a reticular activating system researcher in Mexico City.
Oh, cool.
So let me point out, I had the adventure bug.
Yeah, I was about to say you were already looking to get away.
I was ready to, my family, basically never left New York, but I was ready to
Okay.
go.
So
All
you
right. So
hadn't used your passport yet, except for Canada.
I don't even know if I had a passport. I
Oh,
don't know
okay.
if
I
I had
don't
a
know if you
passport.
needed it. You'd been in the U.S. and Canada at this point.
I had never been outside of the eastern part North America.
Okay. Okay.
Basically.
Hmm.
Very, very parochial, but I knew there was a big world out there.
But New York is sort of international, so it's hard to be parochial when you come from there.
Fair enough. I applied to Hernandez Peon. I never heard back from him. He got killed in a car accident during
Oof.
in that time frame.
Oh
So
gosh.
that's why you've never heard of him. He was
Did
very
it work
famous.
then that you had to write directly to the person you wanted to supervise you and before you got into the school?
Yes, and these days you wrote and said that you have a postdoc opportunity for me.
I see.
Could I come there and work and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote to somebody in California, in Stanford, who did work with monkeys, and I wrote, signed my name, etc. And you got any room? No, you're allowed. And I got back a letter saying, "Dear Miss or Mrs. Why are you interested in coming to the Bay Area? Does your husband have a job here?"
What? Oh,
So
Lynn, I see. Oh gosh, that's funny.
that's my first name. I've had this mistake has been made multiple times actually, and this
Oh, what an
and this
insight you must have gotten into
and oh, you
the
betcha.
way things work.
You betcha. I tell this story frequently, by the way, to
Yeah,
every
great.
graduate class I've ever run. I tell this story about what it was, about how I got a little bit of insight into what it's like to be a woman in the
Mm-hmm.
field.
Mm-hmm.
Right there, then that was a wake up call. So I didn't write back to him. That was it. I just dropped
Good
it.
for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you who it was because he's dead now, but it doesn't matter. But subsequently, I met him. It's a him, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Subsequently, I met him, and told him about this. He didn't remember it at all, and he apologized profusely and became my champion forever. Basically, it's true. He became my champion after that, and he was a man of
Oh
considerable
wow. I guess he was embarrassed, but
power. So I
and you're not
didn't
going
dare.
to tell me who it is.
Yeah,
Okay, should I try to guess?
it was called Prebrum.
Oh, wow, that's huge. That's quite a name to.
Yeah, but he
So
just
you
played
you
out.
just turned that one down, and the
I
third one,
just
I guess.
that. All right, now I'm down to my third choice. Now my third choice was the guy in Prague who basically brought spreading depression to the world, Jan Buresh.
Oh
And
wow.
so I wrote to him and said,
Oh, that goes back to your master's. Yeah. Okay.
go back to my message. Can I come to Prague to work on, when I have some ideas about using spreading depression to study learning? And he said, yeah, I'd love to have you. He was just beginning to have some Westerners come to the lab. I'd love to have you, but I can't pay you. So if you can get money, you can come. So
Oh
then
wow.
I applied for the NIH postdoc. John applied for one as well to go to London. We both
Wow. And
got
you
them.
both got it. Was that hard to get at the time? I mean, that sounds like winning the lottery these days, but.
It was winning a lottery, but
Mm-hmm.
amongst the reasons I was interested in going to Prague, Styles back again, was the previous year, maybe a year and a half before I was ready to leave. Another graduate student whose name is Philip Liss. This is not a name you would know because
I don't know.
his story did not end well. But
Mm.
Philip Liss, who we all acknowledged was brilliant, crazy but brilliant.
He was part of your crew there at
He was
McGill.
part
Is that what you said?
McGill. He was one of the absolute brilliant ones.
Oh.
He took a postdoc working in Poland in the Nensky Institute for
Here.
Fundamental Biology with Konorski in Warsaw.
Oh, why do I know that name?
Well, Konorski is very famous. Konorski was the most famous Polish neuropsychologist. He was already famous in the West. He published a book in 1967 where Philip Liss is acknowledged in the front of that book.
Oh, wow.
Konorski had come to visit McGill because, of course, if you ever got out to the West, if you were in Eastern Europe and you got out to the West,
that's where you went.
You came to McGill because you wanted to visit with Hebb.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we got to meet everybody.
Gosh, wow.
So Konorski, not only did we have access,
crossroads,
but it was a crossroads, like UCL, very much.
Yeah, now. Like UCL.
So we met Konorski. Konorski stood in front of that blackboard that room that I was telling you, the surgery, lunches, and Konorski was in that room at that blackboard talking to us about synaptic this and that. It was spectacular.
Wow,
and
that is amazing.
He was a dynamo. He was like, I now think of him as just this short guy, except that he was probably the same height I am. He was the short guy who looked a bit like me with no hair at this point. I'm thinking, not a bad comparison. Anyway, he was really something. And Phil got taken with him and applied to do a postdoc with him and got a fellowship and went with him. And so Phil, who I was quite close with and stayed with afterwards, wrote me from Warsaw and said, "This is great. You really ought to try something like this. Why don't you think about going to coming to go to Eastern Europe.
That
And
got
so
your
that
curiosity
it
going.
was that got me sort of said it's doable, right? And he had a wife and a kid. He was there with a wife and a kid.
Okay.
It's
You
doable.
had 2 kids by
Had
now.
2 kids by this
Okay.
point, 2 little kids. A, it was doable, and B, it was fun, and you could get a grant, and I was interested in politics too. Phil wasn't. Phil couldn't have cared about the politics at all.
Okay.
I thought, wow, I could go there and see what it's like to live in a socialist country, see what it's really like to live under socialism.
Had you read anything about Prague before
Well,
that?
I had read something about Prague. I didn't know a lot about it. Luckily, in 1967 was the World's Fair, the World's Expo in Montreal.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
And so there was a Czech pavilion, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
It was innovative. It showed off, Czech culture in a very positive way. So that was what we knew about Czechoslovakia. So at the Czech pavilion in Montreal at Expo, we went there sight unseen, basically, and just showed up.
That must have been spectacular, because Prague, I remember the first time I went, how spectacular it was, and by then it was already very well known to the West.
Showed up at the train station, and you walk out, come out the train station. The train station's been modernized, so what you're seeing when you come out the train station is not the train station that I arrived at. Train station.
But you mean the one near the monument there, the main one?
Yeah, the train station, Hlavní nádraží.
Okay.
It's right there, just off to the side of the top of Wenceslas Square.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. And you walk out, and then almost immediately, a little bit to the right, I know Prague extremely well. A little bit to the right is the powder tower, called Prázdná brána. So you step out of this train station. You're a kid from New York. You have never seen anything.
First time in Europe.
First time in Europe. Well, actually, we'd been in Paris and Amsterdam for a few days, but first time in medieval Europe.
Yeah.
And you step
There's
into
nothing like that. Yeah.
And it was mind-blowing. It was absolutely mind-blowing. Prague was, dirty, but gorgeous in those years. It was just spectacular. Prague, to me, is the top.
It is.
I love Prague.
There's something very special.
I went there. I loved it. And go back to Philip Liss, the guy who started it all. On the day before the Russian invasion of Prague, I got a telegram from Phil Liss, who was visiting in Warsaw, telling me I'm on the flight I'll be in Prague tomorrow.
On the day of the invasion.
On the day of the invasion, he was about to visit me in Prague. He had been in Warsaw, and then of course the Russians came instead of Phil.
So you arrived in Prague at the train station with your 2 little kids and your wife and some suitcases.
2 little kids and my wife, and was greeted there by my mentor, Jan Boresh.
He had a wife
took us to an apartment. He had very famous Olga Burashova. She was not with on that occasion, but I met her. Yeah.
He picked you up in a car?
Yeah, picked us up. I guess he had a car. Yeah, he did have a car. That's right. And he drove us north. We didn't know this. He drove us north to an apartment that we were meant to share. We were going to live in one bedroom of a shared apartment about 45 minutes from the Institute. This was the arrangement.
Goodness.
And within a day or two, my then wife rightly said, "This is not going to work. This ain't working." And I went to him and said, "This can't work. This will not work." And he then found, within a 10-minute bike ride of the Institute, in a little town adjacent, suburb of Prague, it was like a village at this point, right across from a pond, a lake, the upstairs of a house that we could rent. That was like perfect. Wow. We found the perfect place, having, found this place that was totally unacceptable. I have no idea what they imagined how we could function in that setting. But the first few days were funny because, of course, we had no language whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then just going out trying to find some food and trying to explain to people what it is you want.
Was it stressful or was it kind of exciting? Both.
It was amusing. It was stressful in the sense I couldn't find anything because everything then. This was not the Prague of now. Again, this was Prague 1967. That means the grocery stores didn't have like fancy packages. Everything was in brown paper bags with a label on it.
So how could you tell what you were buying?
I just wanted to buy some cereal for my kids, and I walked out with a pound of rice, basically, because I couldn't.
That's wonderful. Yeah, no translation devices to help.
Yeah, no translation device, nothing. We were just completely on our own. For the first
Oh,
few
wow.
days, it was pretty fun.
But then
But
you
we
learned.
adapted pretty quickly. And the place we moved into in the countryside was incredible. The neighbors across the street were an older couple with some kids of their own, young married couple included. And the older couple kind of adopted us like grandparents. I mean, it turned out to
Oh,
be
that sounds
absolutely.
wonderful. And
I
did you
loved
learn?
Prague.
Did you pick up the language? Did the kids pick up the
I
language
took the
or?
language probably because I had to. I
So,
mean, I'm
wow.
looking at
Okay.
the time now, we're just about out of it. When the invasion came, I left
Yeah, I want to hear about that. By
because,
somehow you had gotten a VW bus by then too. I know because
oh yeah, we had a VW bus and we
when did
toured
you get
around
that? Did you go get that in Germany? Because you couldn't have gotten
in
that in
Germany.
Prague.
Got that early on, basically, and I did not drive. My wife was the driver.
Oh,
I
okay.
did not drive. It was a little unusual, but she was the
Yeah.
driver. It's not like that anymore. I learned how to drive finally. You go up in New York, you don't need a car. Go to Montreal, you don't need a car.
Hmm.
You go, it turned out I didn't need a car mostly places I lived, but
Yeah.
Prague, it was useful. It was good that my wife drove.
Hmm.
Anyway, we left because the Boris said, I can't guarantee the safety of your children. You should probably leave. And I called up John, who was the only other person I knew in Europe.
The
And I
only other
said,
person. Yeah.
and we said, we're leaving. Can we come and camp out with you in London for a little while? And he said,
Oh,
of
wow.
course. So
So,
we packed everything up, we drove out. There's a lot of stories there, which I won't go into now. And we decamped in London in John's apartment for a couple of weeks. But by then it was clear that that marriage that I was in was not worth preserving anymore. So we split up. In the midst of all of this turmoil,
oh,
it turned
sounds
out to
very
be,
chaotic.
it's very chaotic, but under conditions of chaos, sometimes you take decisions that you
Hmm.
are not otherwise.
Things become
You're
clear.
you're bumped out of your local your local minimum, and you can do things you might not otherwise do.
That's
And
true.
we did
You
that,
get a
and
certain sense of
it was
clarity.
the right thing to do. It was the
But I
right
need to
thing
hear
to do.
about this trip.
Meanwhile,
So you drove in the VW bus to London
yeah,
with
we
the
drove out,
kids.
we drove down with the kids, we drove down to Austria,
Yeah.
out that way to the south, and then from Austria all the way across Europe onto the ferry and over to London with the kids. Stayed there for a little while, then we decided enough, and she took the kids and went to Spain in the van and left me behind, and I stayed for 8 months. Transferred my grant to London and did some work there. Found a place to live, all of that kind of stuff. And then went and took the kids back because they didn't want to be with her and she didn't want them.
Oh
And I
gosh.
took the kids and
That
I took
sounds
the kids
really
and went back.
challenging.
I went back to Prague with the kids as a single father, which in Prague turned out to be a lot easier than you would think it would be in most
Because you had so
places.
much community, maybe.
They had well, it was partly the community, the people that across the street. I lived in the same place again, but it was partly that it was the free daycare, the free healthcare, the free everything. It was all laid on because all the women had to work there. Everything had to be set up so that women could
That's
work.
true, right? That's my friends tell me
So
that too. There was a lot
for a
more
single father, it
system.
was actually very sustainable. I mean, was on my own. I wasn't, and I'm getting back to why I had to learn Czech. If I wanted to have any kind of a social life, I had to learn some Czech.
Oh, okay.
So
That's a good motivating force.
that was partly what drove me to learn some Czech.
Also,
Was it
lots
was the
of lovely people around, I imagine.
There were a lot of people around that I wanted to interact with, shall we
Yeah.
say? So
I have to go
that
back to
was
this one moment though when you arrive in London because I have kind of written about this a little. I'm trying to kind of visualize it. So you arrived there first with everyone, right, in the bus, or did you arrive alone? And was
right.
John?
Everybody in the bus
What
parked
was
right in
the
front of
weather
John's
like? Were
apartment.
you exhausted? Did John come out and meet
And
you?
probably, although they live up on the sixth floor of I think then it might not have even had an elevator, or if it had an elevator, I remember. So yeah, I think John must have come out, but I can't honestly say any of the details per se. I don't remember the actual moment of arrival. I do remember that the weather was crappy. This was August. The weather was pretty lousy. I remember that. I remember that the trip over on the ferry was, not so pleasant. But other than that, I don't remember very much because it all got jumbled up together and
Did
trying
he
to
have
figure out
a
what the hell.
guest room that you all slept in? Did you sleep on the couch or?
Yeah, he had a big apartment. He still has the same apartment that he's been living in
Oh
since
wow.
forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big apartment. and we were, in one of the rooms of this big apartment. But after about 10 days, it was like, oh, what are you going to do, Lynn?
Yeah, maybe you
kind
should
of.
find something.
They had a baby as well at that point.
Oh,
So they were not without their own responsibilities, and and I realized it. So we moved on.
sounds like a time of very big changes, because you went back to Prague, but then by then, did you know that you wanted to go to London to work with?
Yes, yeah. And in
Okay.
the time that I was in London, John and I figured it would be nice if we were in the same lab. Not that we would work together. That wasn't the idea. But
Okay,
just
just
that
to
we
be
were
nearby.
compatible. We were very simpatico. We thought a bit, we had a very similar background training wise.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. And then we actually cooked up a job for me. We arranged a job, a lectureship in the anatomy department. It was all set up. I went back to Prague with this already
Oh,
clear. I was
wonderful.
going to go back to Prague, kids, spend a year and a half there, deal with them in a setting where I could, and
Mm-hmm.
then I would come back to London, and I would have this job in the anatomy department, and that's exactly what happened. A lot of other things happened in between, but that happened work wise. That's exactly how it played out. I went to Prague. I got a lot done. I published a bunch of papers. I had a really good time there. It was really fabulous. I
Sounds
met
like it
some.
was very productive for you, even though you had so much
It was
personal
quite
stuff
productive.
going on.
It was quite productive in the midst of all of that personal stuff. That's true, but I think I've always been sort of good at compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
And then I went back to London, and then that's the whole other chapter started there, because fairly quickly the place cell thing happened, and then I
Mm-hmm.
abandoned what I was thinking. So when John discovered the place cells, I abandoned the visual system, which I had been thinking I was going to go back to. That's connected to the Prague work that I did. I thought this is just too interesting, and we started to think about what would be the implications of there being a Tolman-like cognitive map. What would that mean? For how we think about the hippocampus, how we think about its role in memory, how it relates to other structures in the brain, how to interpret all the data that's out there already. What would it
Mm-hmm.
mean for all of these things? And we sort of said, well, there's a kind of an interesting theoretical framework here. So
But you
initially,
were you were working in the same hallway, or how was it? Like, how were you in the
oh yeah,
same
yeah, we
office
were like
building?
we were in the same hall. We were like two doors from each other. We were in
Okay.
and out of each other's all the time.
But
I mean,
neither of you were really working on Hippocampus yet, or you were starting to at the end of the 60s.
he
You were, of
was. He had
course, still.
started on it before
Okay.
I had done, but I was not at that point. I started when I showed up there. I started with the intention of physiology of vision lab, where I was
Oh,
going to
okay.
trace down visual memory traces from one hemisphere to the other.
Oh, okay.
Building.
But I have this image, tell me if it's correct or not, that he sort of came to you because you had done so much work on the hippocampus already. And when he found these.
At the very beginning, he had seen the cells. He had his ideas already a little bit, but yeah, he came to me because literally, it was early in the discovery. Look at what I'm seeing in the hippocampus. Yeah, you know something about the hippocampus. You did your dissertation on it. What do you think? What do you make of this? It was just like that,
And was it
and it was
just
pretty clear
immediately
what.
like, oh, it's definitely something with
It
space?
was immediate to him. He didn't need me to tell him what he had already seen. He just wanted to
But confirmation is,
confirm.
yeah.
And then, like, okay, what now? I jumped on it. I thought this is fabulous, and then we very quickly saw that this would have big ramifications in the hippocampal world. That this might offer a way of understanding, the disjunct between animal and human stuff. It opened up
Mm-hmm.
lots of possibilities if one explored it, and we started to explore it. I don't think we at that point understood how it could also open up sort of possibilities for thinking about the brain more generally, more
Mm-hmm.
broadly, a way of thinking about the brain and behavior. In other words, we were kind of making up, you might say, a framework for cognitive neuroscience without actually thinking that's what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
We just
Mm-hmm.
imagined.
Yeah, we have to talk about that later, because there's so much there, especially like you really blew my mind a little bit when you brought up the predictive processing, because I've studied that and I just hadn't really quite connected it, that mental models basically are cognitive maps. And a lot of the stuff in that book actually is
Yeah,
already
yeah.
presaging a lot
Again,
of what's coming up.
think without realizing it. I don't think we understood just how, but it is all there. The whole
Yeah.
notion of that's what the system is doing, is constantly predicting. And then the misplaced cells are the kind of prediction error detectors.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all there, although I don't think that was our intention. So I don't want to take credit for it.
No, of
But I
course
think
not.
it was
And it's coming from different lineages, because I don't think you mentioned Helmholtz and
part
all
of the
this.
framework.
Yeah.
It was part of the framework, certainly, that emerged, because shortly after, and I've told this story in a couple of venues where I insulted the editor of Psych Review. We had initially been intending to publish in Psych Review. So having insulted the pompous editor of Psych Review,
I love that. I love it that John went along with you too and just left.
what else was he going to do?
Yeah. It's good that happened, because otherwise you would have had a paper maybe instead of all these years working on that.
Who knows? We might have ended up with a Psych Review paper and 35 citations, and that would have been the end of it.
Yeah.
But that avenue having closed, we then decided, all right, well, we'll write a monograph. Now in those days you could publish thin little monographs. We'll write a monograph and we'll publish it as a one-off
thin little monograph. Haha.
That was how it started. It started as a thin 70-page monograph. And it just kept on building. It just kept building because we kept on seeing that the story had more tentacles than we were aware of. Yeah. And each tentacle tapped into a literature that, if we could connect to it, would strengthen the overall story, because it would be one more bit of converging evidence, so to speak. So we kind of, again, didn't invent, because again, other people were kind of, the notion of converging operations and bringing multiple level analysis. I mean, we built that in right from the start.
Even the idea of neuroscience being interdisciplinary.
The more we saw that, the more it looked appealing, but then the more it meant we were going to have to, at some level, master the literature in 5 or 6 different areas.
Which is crazy. I'm still blown away that you know all this about Kant and so on and so forth. It's really hard to imagine.
But that, in those days you could. In those days you could.
But
I'd like to tell the story.
It takes years.
I'm looking at my bookshelf over here, because I have rebought pretty much all of the books from the 1950s and 60s from the great conferences that were held. Those are in the space of 2 sections of books, maybe 40 books. That was all you had. If you read those 40 books when you were a graduate student, you'd know everything that you needed to know in the whole world.
That's crazy. Now it's like that many papers in an hour.
Now it's that many papers every week, right? Yeah. So it's a totally different world. It was possible to somehow master, and even then we missed a bunch of stuff. It was possible then to get a grip on everything, or at least wrestle with everything. Now it would be absolutely impossible.
Yeah, you would have to.
So once we realized that, then the next thing we knew, we were in the middle of a 6-year project to write a book. We didn't think it would take that long. We didn't anticipate all the ups and downs, personal and otherwise, that would get in the way. We wrote a first draft. We wrote many drafts, typed out by hand in those days.
Oh, on a little. Do you have any of those still?
On a little Olivetti typewriter, if you know that name. Olivetti was
I know that. I like typewriters.
Very famous back in the 1960s. College kids, they were cheap and available. Oh, wow. Olivetti.
Do you still have any of those?
Anyway,
you better put them in an archive or something.
John has them. John has file cabinets full of them, because we put them on different colored paper. They're all going to. We think they're all going to end up at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Science in London.
Oh gosh,
he's negotiating for what's happening with those. I have one. He gave me one chapter, the chapter on anatomy, so I can track a little bit. And he and I have been going back and forth. Yeah, but anyway, it doesn't matter as long as they end up somewhere.
Yeah, as long as they're there.
We ended up with a draft that we thought might be worth getting some feedback on. It was about 300 typewritten pages. We paid for 40 copies of that 300 pages, and we sent it around unbidden to a bunch of experts in the various fields that we had, to philosophers, to psycholinguists, to hippocampal people who knew about it a little bit. Yeah. We just sent it out for commentary. And we got comments back from a lot of people, a lot of useful feedback. And then it took another 4 or 5 years to finish the job.
Did they just write their
Sending it out
comments
was
right on the manuscript, or how did that work?
some did, some didn't. Some took some of what we said and plagiarized it. I mean, who knows? We took a big chance.
Yeah,
Sent all of that out. It was I don't know that one could get away with doing anything like that now.
Yeah, probably not. But yeah.
And during this time, we also didn't publish. We also didn't publish very much.
Yeah, I guess not. How could you? But I guess you were taken care of in a way that you didn't have to so much at that point.
You were sort of protected and taken care of. Yeah. So that's the story behind the book. There's a lot more.
Yeah, there's more. We'll get into that later. I think we'll let you go for now.
I'm out of the country now for 3 weeks. Well, I'll be in Amsterdam for a few days. Go over there, and then I'll be.
If you all need anything, but I'm going to the States to present some papers. So we're switching places.
We'll only be there for 3 days. It's really just to see the Vermeer.
I'll connect with you again in a month or so.
Right. Glad to talk.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a good trip.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.